Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back on this microphone? Yes, we're okay? Good. Okay, as John says, I'm going to talk about carbon budgets, and carbon budgets, for those of you who don't know, are 5-year ceilings on emissions here in the UK. And I'm going to focus on the fourth carbon budget, which covers the period 2023 to 27. And you may have seen in the newspapers a few weeks ago that there was a bit of a cabinet back and forth about agreeing the fourth carbon budget, which we recommended to the government, but there was agreement a few weeks ago. Now, most of the debates there were not about transport, they were about Tata Steel and electricity-intensive industries. They were general questions about the economy and the recovery, but Philip Hammond did have his concerns, particularly about what we've said on electric vehicles. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'll start with the 2050 target, which anchors all that we do here in the UK on the low carbon agenda. I'll move to thinking about, well, what is the path to 2030, given that 2050 target? I'll translate that to the fourth carbon budget, and then I'll move to, well, it's all very good having ambitious targets, but actually we've got to get emissions down as well. How are we doing in that respect? So first of all, the 2050 target, that's the 80% emissions reduction. It's in primary legislation, the Climate Change Act, means we have to get our emissions in the UK down to 160 million tonnes in 2050. We've got to do that from current levels around about 670 million tonnes. Now, three things to note about that picture. First of all, that 2050 number, the 160 million tonnes, we've pretty much got to plan to do that through domestic abatement, not buying credits, which will be very expensive in the future. Second, there are some sectors where it's going to be very hard to reduce emissions. Obvious ones are aviation and shipping, also agriculture. And the implication of that is, well, the sectors where we've got opportunities to reduce emissions, we have to get those right down. So power pretty much got to get to zero emissions to achieve this target. The same is true of transport, the same is true of buildings. Now, moving from 2050 to 2030, what's an appropriate level of ambition for 2030? There's a number of ways to think about this. So you can say, well, if we've got to have, in the case of transport, for example, if we've got to have zero emissions in 2050, it means we've got to have everybody buying a zero emissions car or van in 2035 because of the 10 to 15 year turnover of the vehicle stock. And that again has implications. If we want 100% purchase in 2030, well, very hard to ramp up from nothing in 2030, so we've got to have significant penetration of low or zero carbon vehicles by 2030. The second way to think about it is economic analysis of what are the abatement costs of the various low carbon options against the projected carbon price. And the third way of thinking about it is, well, the world has to make an emissions reduction to deliver climate objectives. What is an appropriate UK contribution to that through the 2020s? We've used all of those approaches to developing a 2030 indicative target, and the headline is, well, we think it's appropriate to aim for a 60% emissions cut in 2030 relative to 1990. And you can see on this picture, well, how could we get from where we are now to that 60% cut? Well, it's really emissions reductions in three key sectors, and that's power generation, it's transport, and it's buildings. And let me just look at the power generation quickly and then the transport, and the two are very much related. So in the power sector, we've got an opportunity to move to an almost zero carbon power sector by 2030. And what you can see here in these three pictures, the top left shows you that we've got increasing electricity demand through the 2020s. That's because of the development of new markets for electric vehicles and electric forms of heating, so heat pumps in particular. We've also got a very significant reduction in the carbon intensity of power generation over the next 10 years, but that continues and increases through the 2020s, and that's because of investment in renewables, nuclear and CCS. And the combination of those two things is that we go from average emissions of about 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour at the moment to below 50 by 2030. So pretty much a zero carbon power sector is what we should be aiming for over the next 2 decades. Now, the transport story, which I've said is related, well, we're not assuming that people are going to stop wanting to be mobile. So if you look at cars, for example, we do envisage increasing demand over time, over the next 2 decades. But we also envisage very significantly reducing carbon intensity of vehicles, so grams per kilometre emissions. And again, the combination of those two things is that we've got significantly falling emissions over the next 2 decades. And let me show you how we think we can achieve that. I should say this is not a blueprint of where we have to get to by 2030. It's an indicative scenario of things that we think it makes sense to aim for. And it's driven by, I think, 3 principles. First of all, that you can go so far with conventional vehicle efficiency, but you hit the wall at some point, and for us that's around about 70 grams per kilometre on average, so you cannot decarbonise transport through conventional vehicles. Second thing is biofuels. Well, we cannot be planning to have abundant use of biofuels in surface transport given sustainability concerns and the scarce biofuels and bioenergy that we can plan for. We ought to plan to use that in sectors where you don't have alternatives for abatement, and those are aviation and they are industry. So not a big role in our view for biofuels in surface transport given sustainability concerns. Third thing is, well, we think at the moment, looking at the technical and the economic analysis, electric vehicles are probably the most promising option to decarbonise surface transport. We're not ruling out there that we would have a role for hydrogen. Certainly we should be developing hydrogen technology, but for us, electric vehicles look more promising at the moment. And so this indicates those principles. We see in 2030 still a significant penetration of conventional vehicles in new vehicles, so about 40%, but then we've got about 60% of new vehicles in 2030 being either electric or plug-in hybrid. And now we've taken a cautious assumption in this scenario and said, well, most of those will be plug-in hybrids, given that we expect range will still be an issue over the next 2 decades. As you get beyond that, as we have battery technology innovation, well, maybe range will become less of an issue. But 2030 it will be an issue in this cautious scenario. Hence, we've got more plug-in hybrids than electric vehicles. And for anybody who thinks those numbers sound very high, 60% penetration, they are similar, first of all, to the European Commission 2050 pathway. So they have about 60% electric vehicle penetration in new vehicles in 2030, just as we do. And the IEA World Energy Outlook of last year, not this year, but last year looked at this issue, and again they've got similar numbers in their scenarios. So let me come back and say, well, what does that mean in terms of the legislation in the UK? So we've got this 2030 target. Well, the carbon budget is the 5-year ceiling from 2023 to 27. It follows those first 3 budgets that you see in orange and green on the picture there. And so the government has accepted now to legislate 1,950 megatons as the carbon budget on the path to that 60% cut. Headline figure, and this is what was in the newspapers a few weeks ago, that is actually a 50% cut in 2025. The government put that into Parliament a few weeks ago. I think there'll be a debate and a discussion in both of the houses over the next 2 or 3 weeks, but I expect that will be in the legislation by the end of the month. So I said it's all very well setting ambitious targets, but actually how are we doing reducing emissions in transport? This is a picture from our first report to Parliament a couple of years ago on progress reducing emissions. And we said, well, the need for a step change, I've put a question there, but I think obviously there is a need for a step change. And so what you can see, the blue is the pre-recession trend where transport emissions were either going up or coming down. I think on average you can say they're broadly flat. The top line, the red, is a projection of what would happen if we carried on that pre-recession trend, and then the green and the orange are indicative of what we should be aiming to do. And I think you can say, well, going from that red line to the green and even beyond that to the orange is a step change. So we need a step change. It's true at the economy-wide level in terms of emissions reductions. It was true as regards transport. But then, well, what's happened since that first progress report to Parliament? So I'm going to just take you through very quickly what's happened to miles, what's happened to biofuels, what's happened to new car emissions. And there's a pretty positive story to tell. So what you saw in 2009 was that miles went down, particularly in the vans and the HGV sector as a result of the recession. What we've seen in 2010 is further reductions, probably in response to the fuel price increases. We've seen further reductions in HGVs, but we've seen a very big reduction in car miles travelled as well, so that will bring emissions down in 2010. We've seen increasing penetration of biofuels in line with the Renewable Transport Fuel obligation. And then on new car CO2, I think there's a very positive story, not one we necessarily expected and not one we really understand, but we were envisaging that by 2010 we'd get new car emissions down to about 155 grams of CO2 a kilometre. But what's happened is the reduction was, as probably many of you know, from about 160 grams in 2008, we've gone down to about 150 in 2009, and further still to about 144 in 2010. So we're making very good progress. Question for us, is that due to macroeconomic factors? Have people become more conscious of fuel efficiency in their car purchase decisions because of the recession, because of the high fuel prices, and will that change with macroeconomic circumstances? This is a picture for emissions, so about a 3% emissions reduction in 2009, which was partly due to that vehicle kilometres, but it was also due to the, more so due to the fleet efficiency improvements because of the new car emissions. Picture for 2010, well, we do expect at least a 2.5% emissions reduction because of this miles effect and the change in biofuels. What I've not shown you there is the emissions impact of getting the new car average down to 144, because we're not quite clear what that is. It's highly uncertain, but it will take the emissions reduction in 2010 down further. And I think at the moment you can say, well, we are on track. We are reducing emissions in transport beyond what we need to actually over the next 10 years in order to meet carbon budgets. So what are the challenges going forward? Well, I've said I think there's an issue around keeping the progress up on new car emissions, keeping the progress on miles as we come out of the recession, and depending on what happens with fuel prices as well, if oil prices were to go down over the next few years. I think the second challenge, we haven't made much progress on new van emissions. Vans, we've seen increasing emissions over the last few years. It's important to now get an implementing framework in place for the EU targets for the new van emissions. We've got to develop electric vehicle markets. I think the sales there have been a bit slow, but I don't think it's a major problem. I think we're doing the right things on electric vehicles. We've got the support mechanisms from the government. We're doing the right things on charging infrastructure, so we're moving in the right direction. I think on consumer behaviour change, well, smarter choices. I don't think we've seen much evidence of getting miles down through smarter choices. I think there's a big opportunity. I think the government's seen that. I think the Sustainable Travel Fund could pay for that, although I think there's some details we need to feel a bit more confident about there. I think eco-driving, there's very little eco-driving training happened in the last 2 years, so where we envisage that will be tens of thousands of people trained. I think it's in the hundreds and the thousands that have been trained, so there is a lost opportunity. There's a need to do something more there in policy terms if we want to get people driving in an eco-friendly fashion, and then enforcing the speed limit. We've said, well, there's a big opportunity to enforce the speed limit on motorways and reduce emissions, and the government maybe is going in the opposite direction. Let's raise the speed limit, which would not be good for emissions. So we've been pretty clear. As far as carbon budgets are concerned, that would not be a positive thing. So, having taken you very quickly through that stuff on the 2050 target and the fourth carbon budget, let me summarise and say, well, 2050 target is an 80% emissions reduction. That target, by the way, I didn't go into this in detail given the time, that target still remains valid given our latest assessment of the science. So we reviewed all of the 500 papers published in the last couple of years. The 80% target remains appropriate. Corresponding to that, or consistent with that, we should be aiming for a 60% emissions reduction by 2030. The implication of that is a carbon budget, so a limit from 2023 to 27 of 1,950 megatons. That's the 50% cut in 2025, which we should be aiming to achieve through domestic emissions reductions in power, in transport, surface transport in particular, and in buildings. And there is a significant contribution from surface transport. I think the challenge there is we have progressed in 2009 and 2010. The challenge is to build on that progress we've made coming out of the recession with changed macroeconomic circumstances and keeping emissions